If you know anything about the anime industry, you know that it's all very incestuous and insular. Lead directors and writers will work for several different studios, who will in turn take ideas from each other to develop them into other anime. Yoshitoshi Abe might work for a studio to get some of his works, like Serial Experiments Lane, made into anime, and help said studio with character designs in other series. But when he wants to make another work of his into an anime, he might just switch to another studio and take some of that previous team with him for that. Something that only enforces the influence of other anime studios in each other. The fact that most anime is made purely with a Japanese audience in mind, rarely with outsiders working on them as well, really doesn't help this either. This all might help explain why people who aren't really into anime see anime as this one united force of samey media that looks completely alike, as opposed to other mediums like video games or music. This also helps explain why there is so much in anime and otaku culture that seems so odd to outsiders, like catgirls or so-called fan service. Now, I want you to consider for a second an often memed reason for anime's existence in the first place. That of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This might at first seem to be a baseless joke, but much like the unstoppable tide of Islam, there must be some kind of historical basis for it all. It certainly would not be the first time something like this has happened, at the very least. So let's take a look at the historical basis here. First off, before the advent of nuclear arms, the worst thing that could happen to any civilization was annihilation through pillaging and massacre by a superior foe. There are many examples of this throughout history, but none were as efficient and ruthless with this almost forgotten art as the Mongol horde. If your city was within grazing range of these guys, it was completely and utterly fucked. Unless you paid them a pretty little penny. But if not, only a pyramid of skulls would mark where your prosperous hometown once lay. This had immense effects on the world, especially Central Asia, going from one of the richest places on earth due to the Silk Road, to... Not only that, but most of the areas conquered by the Mongols would remain highly protective and closed off after the Mongols left. This effect could most prominently be seen in the lands of the Han and the Rus. Now, to not have this be so easy as to explain it all away with the cultural proximity of China and Japan, I will instead be looking to Russia to explain this. Before the Mongol invasion, the Russian society was quite advanced, and thanks to certain peoples, had great ties to European trade and was pretty well integrated into Europe overall. But after the Mongols had reigned over the Russians for at least 3 centuries, the Rus had been thoroughly left out of the grander European trade and diplomatic networks. This had ended up making Russia not quite Western like their European neighbors, but not quite Eastern either, like the ever-looming Tatar threat. In this respect, the Russians were always seen as some kind of outsider wherever they went. Not as a bad force necessarily, but never quite like the peoples they interacted with. We can already pull parallels here to the modern state of the anime industry and the people who follow it, but we first also have to look at the people who interacted with these Rus. 2 of the peoples who did this the most, and who we have documents from, are ironically enough from the opposite side of Europe, the English and the Dutch. Because of their mercantile interests, they were quite keen on finding a northeastern passage over Russia to the Orient. That is, after all, why it's called the Barents Sea, after a Dutchman. One of these documents comes to us from the man himself, Henry Hudson, who described seeing mermaids in the seas above Russia. This wasn't the first time explorers had reported seeing mermaids in new waters, though. Much has been made of the New World explorers believing manatees to be such. But this is different, for there are no manatees in the Arctic Ocean above Russia. This means one of 2 things. Either the man discovered a new species that we somehow haven't managed to rediscover since, or the Russians were up to something in those waters, as they always are. Most likely to fool Western explorers, which sets things up to an even bigger parallel here, once you factor in the cat girls mentioned earlier. The Russians being left more on their own, though, is not to say that they stagnated at all. Again, much like the anime industry, it simply moved into other directions than the trends of the outside world. Whereas other shows might focus on plot and character development, anime focuses on characters as they are and simply having a good time. So too did the Russians expand with amazing speed into Siberia, as the rest of the world focused on setting up trade colonies to China, or building up their mercantile systems. In comparison, the most trading the Rus ever did was the fish in the north with Norway. Hold on. Hey! On another note of how Russia was and is viewed by the outside world, everyone either seems to over or underestimate them. During World War I, the point of the Germans' Schlieffenplan was to knock France out of the war before Russia could mobilize. But the Russians ended up being ready for the war way before expected. A large part of Germany's reason to push for war in 1914 in the first place, though, was that they feared the Russian Empire growing stronger than them in only a couple of years. So really, we can see that the same country was both under and overestimating Russia at the same time, mostly due to how they couldn't really understand them, as they would repeat this mistake some 25 years later as well. In the same vein, Western followers of animism often overestimate the medium's ability to win international prizes, like Oscars, whilst a lot of people also cast anime aside as some weird thing without much influence in the West, where in reality, both lines of thought are simply wrong. I could go on all day with examples if I wanted, but I believe what I've said up to this point suffices. With this, I think I've made quite the solid case for the so often jokingly mentioned hypothesis of the nuking of Japan leading to anime. And if not directly leading to it, then at least thoroughly explaining why it's viewed as so strange by outsiders, with a broader historical perspective. Thank you, and good night.
Waving branches break the sound, lonely forest, trembling ground. Masquerading leaves of blue run circles round the morning dew. Patterns understood by you, reaching out beyond and before.